This section is about how humanity came to think about geoengineering. It's kind of a meandering path, so I will just add a list of key events I found on the web, of course, to say what are the steps that occurred in the past that could be interpreted as geoengineering in thought. And of course there have been many. This starts by saying, coming to think this way, man is able to modify the influence of the climate that he inhabits to fix, you might say, the temperature most convenient to him. Le Comte de Buffon, Histoire naturelle from 1785. How about my French pronunciation, right? So just some key events. 1841, American meteorologist James Pollard, SP, publishes The Philosophy of Storms, in which he lays out his thermal theory of storm formation and details a method through which rain may be produced artificially in time of drought. So we still have cloud seeding and so on that are going on, which can be considered geoengineering at small scales. Of course, science on whether it works is still out there in terms of debates. 1896, Svante Arrhenius always gets mentioned for doing the first calculations on the impacts of carbonic acid on acid rain and warming, and calculations of how much warming we get if we double the CO2 and so on. So he argues Earth's temperature would increase roughly by 9 degrees Fahrenheit, which surprisingly then leads him to suggest that in 1908 that by increasing the amount of carbonic acid in the atmosphere, we may hope to enjoy ages with more equitable and better climates. Okay, so he thought there could be beneficial effects, and he's not that wrong. Global warming continues to create winners and losers, which is a big part of why geoengineering also has to think about whether the impacts of geoengineering can be really controlled and make sure that the most vulnerable that are already paying a price for the emissions by the rich are again going to suffer from modifying global climate, engineered climate as we call it. In 1932, Soviet Union establishes the Institute of Rainmaking in Leningrad, setting the stage for decades of experimentation with cloud seeding as a means of altering the weather. US started it in 1946. Success of these experiments is greatly exaggerated, but scientists do manage to alter weather patterns on small scale. So there is geoengineering that's happened for a while now. 1958, if an unfriendly nation gets into a position to control the large-scale weather patterns before we can, the result could even be more disastrous than nuclear warfare. Howard Orville, US President Dwight Eisenhower's weather advisor. Okay, it was considered a national security issue as well. And there have been, again, many advisory councils which have gone after geophysical wars of creating storms, using earthquakes for as weapons of war, and so on and so forth. Okay, the Jason Group apparently did that. 1965, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson's Science Advisory Committee issues a landmark report restoring the quality of our environment that warns of the potentially harmful effects of fossil fuel emissions. Considered the first high-level government statement on global warming, the report also raises the possibility of deliberately bringing about countervailing climate changes, including raising the albedo or reflectivity of the Earth. So as soon as it was clear that we are affecting the climate, there were also thoughts put in the report about reducing our impact with geoengineering approaches. 1967 to 72, the US Air Force flies more than 2,600 cloud seeding sorties over North and South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia as part of a covert effort to extend the monsoon season, inhibit North Vietnamese movements. There were also spraying of certain chemicals like Agent Orange, which were to remove vegetation, burn it off, so the enemy had no place to hide. War and scaled geoengineering-like experiments. 1974, Soviet climatologist Mikhail Budikov floats the idea of reversing global warming by burning sulfur in the stratosphere, thereby creating a reflective haze he describes as much like that which arises from volcanic eruptions. And we got very good data from the Pinatubo eruption, as we saw earlier. Okay, so in subsequent years, scientists propose everything from injecting particles into the stratosphere to lobbying great mirrors into space to reflect sun's rays. So these are not new ideas that we are discussing today. Moved to in December 1976, moved to act by the United States cloud seeding activities in Vietnam. UN General Assembly approves the Environmental Modification Convention. Okay, so it was signed on by many tens of countries. May 1990, IPCC, established in 1988, declares unequivocally that increased carbon emissions are substantially augmenting greenhouse effect. Unless emissions are cut by 60%, the panel warns global temperatures could rise by as much as 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit over the next 110 years. So the evolution of the impact, our impact on global climate, radiation budget, and so on, led to negotiations that started and, as we said, haven't managed to budge the emission trajectories yet. These are not supposed to be polemics against environmentalism or safely doing climate mitigation and adaptation, but to go through the sequence of things that have to make us think. Can we really, with all that we have planned, keep the global warming within target? That's the main point. Okay, I hope that's clear. August 2006, Paul Crutzen, winner of the 1995 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his research on ozone, calls international action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions a pious wish. In a now famous article in Climatic Change, he advocates for additional geoengineering research, especially into the possibility of using reflective aerosols to decrease the amount of sunlight that reaches the Earth's surface. Crutzen's article provokes vigorous criticism, especially from scientists who fear it'll hand governments an excuse not to reduce carbon emissions. So, if you say it could be fixed with geoengineering, then will the governments be tempted to say, let's not waste too much time reducing emissions? Legitimate concerns. But it thrusts geoengineering into the mainstream, inspiring reams of additional research. November 2006, a NASA conference in Silicon Valley. Lowell Wood, a former top weapons designer at the Pentagon, lays out an instant climatic gratification scheme to reverse global warming. The plan involves using artillery fire as much as 1 million tons of sulfate aerosols into the Arctic stratosphere in order to dull the sun's rays and build up sea ice that could then cool the planet. Science historian James Fleming, writing in Wilson Quarterly, likens Wood's plan to declaring war on the stratosphere. Crazy idea, but scientifically feasible. August 8, 2008, 4 hours before the opening ceremony of the Olympics in Beijing, Chinese authorities launched more than 1,000 rockets containing silver iodide into the sky outside to keep the city to keep rain clouds away from Bird's Nest Stadium. A storm that would forecast to hit on August 8 holds off until August 10th, keeping the crowd of 91,000 dry for the evening of the pageantry. Was it really accomplished by these silver iodide? Well, you have to decide. October 2008, Scientific American publishes an editorial titled Hidden Dangers of Geoengineering that calls out the risks of trying to tinker our way out of climate catastrophe. What used to be fringe science, the editors write, has gained respectability, but it could damage the ozone layer, reduce precipitation, and make rainfall more acidic. And those are just the foreseeable effects. 2009 April, US President Barack Obama's science advisor John Holdren says the United States doesn't have the luxury of taking geoengineering options off the table. Okay, so Holdren says they have got to be looked at, so not something that people can just throw away. 2009, playing with Earth's climate is a dangerous game with unclear rules, says Robert Jackson, director of Duke University's Center on Global Change. September 2011. It's famous for something else, but nonetheless, a British academic consortium called Stratospheric Particle Injection for Climate Engineering attempts to carry out the world's first large-scale geoengineering field test aimed at reversing global warming. But experiment a smaller version of the group's grand plan to pump reflective particles into the atmosphere through a 20-kilometer long hose held aloft by a hot air balloon, which we looked at, never gets off the ground for political reasons. The same is happening now in the US with the National Academy saying research should be done, and then the report cannot even be found on the web anymore. So the forces fighting against geoengineering are pretty strong. 2012, National Natural Science Foundation of China, which distributes research funds on behalf of the Chinese government, lists geoengineering as a scientific research priority. Already China is spending at least 100 million per year on weather modification schemes, mostly to induce rain and prevent hailstorms. CIA partners with National Academy of Sciences to fund a 21-month, 630,000 technical evaluation of various geoengineering techniques. May 2013, average daily atmospheric concentration of CO2 passes 400 ppm. So it's a dreadful but maybe the only way to prevent mass calamity, says Nicholas Thompson to opine on the dangerous, fraught and potentially essential prospect of geoengineering. Again, the sense that it is inevitable. Finally, IPCC's Working Group for Policy Responses to Climate Change will evaluate geoengineering options, including the use of aerosols, ion fertilization, where ocean is driven into more photosynthesis and drawdown, and lighter colored crops to increase albedo in its fifth assessment report, marking the first time that UN body will have actively considered invasive measures for halting climate change. This report is supposed to come in 2021. Obviously, COVID may delay it. The move, as The Guardian put it when IPCC's research agenda became public in 2011, suggests the UN and rich countries are despairing of reaching agreement on how to combat global warming. Okay? So, this is how the few events along the way, including the Pinatubo eruption, can be thought of as the evolution of geoengineering. Of course, if you go back, you will find other evidences where there were ideas of modifying climate, modifying geology to affect climate, modifying land to make more rain, and so on and so forth have been around. So we'll come back and discuss some of the other ideas, or how the thought process has been affected by humans along the way.